So my things are a bit different this evening. My laptop is in the shop, so I'm on a Chromebook, and I don't have my fancy slide program. So I can share the slides, but it's going to be like the way that you guys are used to, with me being in the corner. If you go to view, for people who may not know, if you get bored of one particular view, you can go to view and swap the view of the slide for the view of the video. If you just get bored of one or the other, when that starts to happen, you can refresh what you're looking at. So we will start by setting our motivation. So I'll just do that on our own by thinking about thinking about earlier today, half an hour ago, what motivated us to arrive in the class tonight. Trying to get very clear on those thoughts, what actually was that motivation. But now taking the opportunity to intentionally widen, expand that motivation. So, trying to set the motivation of listening and participating in tonight's class in order to find tools, techniques, ideas that we can put into practice in order to be able to be of greater benefit. If we have some understanding of enlightenment, we can assert that motivation, but just generally, we try to have a very broad, expansive motivation. All right, and with that motivation, we will start the class. So, is there anyone who was here last week who had a question about what we covered, or maybe they just saw the video? I think everyone was here, but anything that we said or covered that we wanted to address before we go on to new material? All right. So we're sort of essentially in this section, kind of a related grouping of ideas that deal with, what it means to be Buddhist. We talked about the four seals, and now we're going to talk about. We ended just before we got to the five lay precepts last week. That's what we will pick up on, the five lay precepts. So this is introducing the ethical teachings of the Buddha. This is a subset. The five lay precepts are a subset of the Buddha's ethical teachings. We'll also talk about the 10 non-virtuous actions, which is a wider um, perspective on ethics than the five lay precepts. So there's a couple of things that are important to understand about the ethical teachings in general. One is that it's critically important not to hear the ethical teachings as being moralistic. And by that, what I mean by that is morality, in my mind, is concerned with rights and responsibilities and kind of a social construct, kind of a person's place in society. you you sometimes can find um, notions in the sutras that are related to that. Um, but what we're going to talk about, so, for example, when we talk about the first precept, not to kill, um, there's we'll see the definition of that and what that specifically means. And then you can also find a, what you might be able to term more of that social perspective, um, that doesn't relate directly to the vow not to kill, but you can see that there are times when the Buddha expresses an interest or a concern about society more generally. For example, um, he talks about if there was no um, interest in the eating of meat, then there would be no one who would take the profession of killing animals. There would be no, because there would just there's that absence. So when he says something like that, um, he we can think of that as not related to the vow, not related to necessarily the karma. So what I mean by not hearing the teachings on ethics, I mean mainly as they relate to individual karmic actions. It we can see that there are other times when the Buddha is not talking specifically about individual karmic actions, um, where he does express, well, if things were like this, then there would be this benefit, or society would be changed in this way. So we also find that that's also true. But we have to distinguish that kind of idea from the ethical teachings as they relate to individual karmic actions, which we ought not hear in those same sort of moralistic terms or those same sort of social constructs. Because all of the karmic actions that the Buddha discusses, positive or negative, they come from his own direct experience in recognizing the energy that underlies that action in the mind and the result that that energy in the mind will bring. So um, that's very different than talking about organizing society in a particular way or the benefits of something in terms of rights or responsibilities. We have to understand that the teachings as they relate to karmic actions are not societal or um, moralistic. They really refer to what, how the mind interacts with the outside world, the relationship between the energies that are present in the mind and the effects that those energies bring. So this gets into a very deep and subtle uh, interrelatedness between the mind and external reality. And it's that subtle interdependent, interrelatedness, and it's the Buddha's direct understanding of that subtle and deep interconnection that gave rise to what, kind of just a warning that the Buddha gave about these energies. He was able to see that these energies correlate in ways that bring suffering or bring more beneficial, conducive circumstances. And he wants people to be free of suffering and to have conducive circumstances. So he taught the method to do that. Um, So it's very important that we understand the individual karmic actions in this ethical context in that way, and not like, oh, this is good, this is bad, this is beneficial for society, this is harmful for society. It would be great if people would all behave in a harmonious way versus, not behaving harmoniously isn't so good. We have to really distinguish between these two ways of thinking, which again isn't to say that the Buddha never expressed any interest in those wider social issues, but they don't pertain to individual karmic actions, in the same way. Okay. So we will move into, okay, so the first of these, so this is just kind of a general quote by the Buddha in a sutra, where again this is underlying the framework, the why the Buddha gave an ethical framework. And another thing to understand about the difference between the precepts, the five lay precepts, and a wider teaching on, for example, the 10 non-virtuous actions, is that the five lay precepts are presented, as I mentioned, they are a subset of a wider ethical teaching. That these five training precepts or lay precepts, they are understood to be five kind of coarser actions that it is reasonable for a person when they take refuge to say, when they actually become Buddhist. It's quite common at that time to take the five lay precepts. The lay precepts and the refuge vows and commitments are actually different things. So a person, it is also possible that a refuge ceremony can just be the refuge vows and commitments. But the five lay vows can also be taken, or even maybe just a couple of the lay vows could be taken. Um, so the five lay vows are coarser actions that it's reasonable to say, from this moment until my death, I will make a strong effort to avoid ever engaging in these harmful actions. Whereas uh, more subtle actions um, are, like getting angry. The Buddha does say that we ought to avoid, you know, um, raising our voice in anger at someone. That is an ethical concern, but it's unreasonable to say, for the rest of my life, I will be able successfully to avoid yelling at someone in anger. So that's not one of the five lay vows. The five lay vows are coarser actions because they're meant to help us to train our mind to move in the direction of ethics. And even, of course, even these five, we will from time to time break. And then that's where purification comes in. But we try to make a sincere effort not to break any of these. Okay. So the first precept is to not kill. And what we'll see, because these are training precepts and because they're not moralistic, because their goal is to help practitioners make progress, they're very practical in that they often will have a, a way of, they will have a way of understanding breaking them where we're we understand that we should really try to avoid even breaking it more lightly. But then there's also a heavier way where if a person engages in that heavier breakage, then we can't really say that they're taking it seriously. And if that person gets to that point, then it's said that they're no longer holding that vow. Um, so once a person takes these precepts, if they kill, as it says here, killing any non-human sentient being damages the vow. That applies to insects, ants, flies, what have you, any kind of sentient non-human being. But of course, it's incredibly difficult to go decades and decades never killing an insect. And this refers to intentional killing, not like the killing that might arise from driving a car. Um, but we can avoid killing another human. We can avoid, that's much easier to do. So, but if we then do kill another human, then that does what is called, uprooting the vow or destroying it from the root. That person has to take that vow again or with a teacher, ideally, in order to say that they are holding the vow. But even when we kill a fly, what have you, we're meant to see that as a negative action that we should abstain from. But it's practical in this way, that it damages but does not destroy the vow. Okay. So, any thoughts or questions? Just on the first, you guys can just unmute if you have a question.
So
go ahead, Jay.
Thanks, Sheila. I do have a question. I struggle with Buddhism and the concept of sentient beings. Because I just, in my heart of hearts, I consider myself a relatively good person, but I don't get the sentient being things with the ants and the spiders and all of that. And there's even a differentiation here, which it damages the vow. It does not destroy the vow. Can you talk a bit about that? And like I say, I do struggle with what sentient means, because also they've done some studies where plants respond to music, for instance, so seemingly there's some sentience there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's my pondering. Thank you.
So His Holiness defines a sentient being. So the definition of a sentient being is mind possessor. So of course, this is one of the many issues that we have to deal with when we're translating into English. The Tibetan, I don't know what the Tibetan is, but the Tibetan word that's being translated as sentient being is more literally translated as mind possessor. So the idea is that it is a being, it is a form that is a suitable host for consciousness. And in fact, consciousness is inhabiting that host. We are a sentient being because we are a body and a mind together. When we die, there's still a body for some time until it totally decays, and then you just have dust at some point. But there's a human body for a period of time, but there's no mind. The mind has separated. So at the moment of death, the physical body is no longer a sentient being. And His Holiness says that we can know whether or not a living thing is a sentient thing if that living thing is capable of volitional movement, meaning that if you observe it for a time, a day, a week, and you film it for that time, and you see any kind of movement that it engages in, if all of those movements can be traced back to some change in the environment, the presence of sunlight, the presence of some kind of change in the chemical gradient in the water. if all of those movements can be traced back to an external event, then that living thing is not a sentient thing. A sentient thing just sometimes goes somewhere just because it wants to. Maybe it thinks that there's food somewhere. Maybe it's right. Maybe it's wrong. It just goes from here to there, and it's not because it's not. Maybe even often there's a change in the environment, but sometimes at least it just moves somewhere. And that is how you can that's how you know that it's a mind possessor. And that applies even to down to things like mosquitoes, things like ants. Um, and it's understood that yes, plants are living things, and they may be able to, and they can do like amazing things. They have amazing abilities. But the Buddhist understanding is that no consciousness ever enters a plant. And so then when you kill a plant, you are not separating body and mind. You're not causing a rebirth. Um, and then the reason that, and I think there's two reasons why there is a difference between the two. One, again, is just practical, that it's almost impossible to never intentionally swat a fly or what have you. So if every time you did that, you destroyed the vow, you would just go crazy. Like it would just be really, really impractical. And two, there is an understanding that human beings have the capacity in that lifetime to achieve enlightenment. And an animal, they have the capacity to achieve enlightenment, but they have to first get a human birth. So there's also a difference in what you're depriving that sentient being of. So in that way, a human life is considered more precious. But again, to intentionally take the life of an animal breaks the vow. It just doesn't destroy the vow.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful.
What about killing before taking vows?
So again, so this goes back to the understanding of the teaching as not moralistic, not a social construct. The Buddha's understanding, or the Buddha's observation, is that whether or not a person has the vows, the reason that the 5 lay vows, the 10 non-virtuous actions, the reason that these are problematic from a karmic standpoint is that the energy that's present in the mind that motivated the action is the kind of energy that when it ripens will bring a painful, unfortunate, suffering kind of result. And so the purpose of the training precepts is to bring mindfulness, to bring like intentional mindfulness to these things, and to really intentionally use one's life to train in avoiding these things. And it's true that when a person takes a vow, the taking of the vow does give, because it's a voluntary act, it's also a karmic act. We are kind of stating our own view that this is important. I take this seriously. I recognize that this is useful for my own growth and development. So in that sense, taking a vow and then not taking it seriously is worse than never having done it. And it's also true that doing something after we understand that it's harmful is worse than doing it before we understood that it was harmful. Um, because now we kind of know, we're like, oh, now I really, and before I was kind of thoughtless. I was, I wasn't paying attention. And of course, even after, when we swat a fly, again, that's a moment of thoughtlessness. That's a lapse in our mindfulness. And it's not malicious. It can, I mean, but which is different than, for example, hunting, where, you know, and I mean that, for sport. If a person's starving and they're trying not to die, that's a bit different. But when they're doing it for sport, or, you know, for an unnecessary reason, then there's so much more intentionality behind it, that it's stronger. It's a more negative action than that momentary lapse of swatting the fly that you did just, out of habit, or, you know. So there's a great deal of uh, different parts to what makes a karmic action more or less weighty, and we'll get into that a bit as we go on. But um, but yeah, so it is the case that we still need to be concerned about negative actions that were done even before we took, even Buddhism would say, even in past lives, we need to be concerned about the negative actions that were done, because they are negative due to the energy that was present in the mind prior to engaging in the action, that animated the action. And the action itself really is just the fruition of that energy. It's just the way in which that energy is manifesting, but it's the energy that is the real concern. Uh, and it applies equally to all sentient beings. And the Buddha is just giving us a warning about what he has observed.
Thank you. We'll probably have to come back to this. I have some more questions, but yeah, thank you.
Anything else? So again, this is just another quote. So this doesn't apply only to directly killing, but it applies to directing someone else to kill. For killing, there does need to be a living sentient being in front of you, and then you engage in some action that you intend to bring about the death of that sentient being. To have this, and we'll talk about complete and incomplete and all that in terms of the different kinds of karmas, but it doesn't only, it also applies to looking at the cockroach and saying to your husband or wife, kill that for me. That also applies. And really, in a way, it's worse, because you're causing someone else to also create negative karma. And then this is just a quote about the benefits. So again, here, you can see here, this is something where the Buddha is expressing some of those more cultural benefits. Where he's saying, that we, by abstaining from killing, we're protecting life. We're benefiting sentient beings. And this is how we benefit sentient beings, is by training and abstaining from killing. So then the second precept is to not steal. And to steal is to take anything that has not been freely given, and by freely given, that relates to by a person who has a valid claim to the thing. So this refers to, it could be, this refers to objects, but could be animate or inanimate objects. So in a way, it refers to property. So if an animal is legally considered property, then it would apply to that. But to basically to take the property of someone else when that property has not been freely given. And if the other person stole it first, then they don't have the right to freely give it. But you have to kind of know. So we'll see here. This is a little bit of a obtuse quote, but the volition, so the intention, with, again, here, thievish intent means that um, you know that something doesn't belong to you. You know that it in fact belongs to someone else, and they have a valid claim to it. And yet you remove it from their possession, and then you perceive it as belonging to yourself. You appropriate it, and you now think this is mine. So you see that someone else has a phone. You clearly see the phone on the table. You saw them come in with the phone. You saw them put the phone down, and then you just think, this is their phone, but I would like this phone, and therefore that's the kind of thievish intent. So here, thievish intent also means that you don't really have a good, valid reason. So, for example, you might take someone's car keys who's been drinking, and you don't, you know that those aren't your car keys, but you don't have this kind of thievish intent. It's not like you want their car. You don't want to appropriate their car for yourself, and you don't regard it as now your car. You're actually just trying to prevent them from killing themselves, killing other people. So you're not actually taking it and thinking of it as your own. Um, but anytime that we take anything of any value, um, so the idea of like what we, generally the idea is that we really should be very careful with this and just not take anything that doesn't belong to us. The actual breaking of the vow, generally they say that the value of the item has to be sufficient to be able, that it breaks a law in the country that one lives in. So if you take, if you take a leaf from someone's pile of leaves, we should probably avoid doing that, but it doesn't break the vow. But if you take even something, I don't know what exactly the laws are in different places, but could be even something that's maybe $5 or $10, or $25, then if they can bring some kind of suit against you for it, then that has broken the vow. So again, related to making this very practical, not making it so onerous that it's impossible to uphold, but still, thinking of it as a training precept and not a moralistic edict. But really, we need to avoid taking anything that's not given. That would damage the vow. Taking anything that's not given would damage the vow, certainly. Any questions about that? No. Okay. Good. I thought with this, if I accidentally click, I have to start all over again because I don't, it's PowerPoint. Okay, so the third precept is to not commit sexual misconduct. And sexual misconduct has two types. There's adultery, and then there's non-consensual sexual behavior. So adultery is something that a person does in the context of a monogamous relationship. But that doesn't necessarily refer to marriage. It refers to just what it says, the realistic expectation of monogamy. That could be just a dating relationship, what have you. If there is a realistic expectation of monogamy that you violate, you have committed adultery. And here, again, because all of these are very practical, there's a spectrum of sexual misconduct. To fully break the vow requires a completed, full, consecrated sexual act, and we can all kind of understand what that means. That fully breaks the vow. But even something quite light, like, kissing, something like that, that would, in the context of a reasonable expectation of monogamy, that would very lightly damage the vow. So again, because it's a training precept, because this is meant to help the practitioner adopt constructive behaviors, we don't break the vow every time we do inappropriate flirtation, what have you. But it is something that damages a realistic expectation of monogamy. And I use the word realistic because, of course, we could be in some kind of relationship, not me, but y'all could be in some kind of relationship where the other person kind of has an unrealistic expectation of monogamy, like it's the second date or something, and they might get their feelings hurt because they held on to some unrealistic expectation. But if there's an agreed upon monogamy, where it's the boundaries are kind of clear, then violating it is a problem. And then the second doesn't refer to intimate relationships. It just refers to behavior. So anything that's non-consensual would would constitute sexual misconduct. So that could be with a total stranger, even if a person is single. Anything that's non-consensual is problematic and rises to the level of sexual misconduct. So there's two different ways in which that's practiced. Any questions about that? Okay. And then the fourth is to not lie. So to lie, again, we have to intentionally communicate something that we know to be untrue. And the sentient being has to be able to, be conscious, be speaking the same language that we are, and they have to be able to understand what we're saying. So it's an intentional attempt to mislead or to deceive or to cause someone to believe in something that we know to be untrue. If it is untrue, but we ourselves believe it, if we ourselves have been deceived by misinformation, then it's not a lie. We have to know that we're communicating something to someone that is something that we know to be untrue. And again, what's relevant here, what's particularly relevant with all of these is, again, the motivation behind it. Why? Because with this, of course, we might, if we followed this precept, to the letter every day, all of the time, then that might mean that, if we know that person A intends to harm person B, and person A asks us where person B is, and we know, then if we mislead them, then we're lying. And we might feel like, oh, well, I can't lie, so I have to tell them where that person is, even if I expect or anticipate that by so doing, that person might be injured, might be killed, might be placed in some great danger. We have to recognize that, we can't always uphold these in the face of some great harm that might arise by upholding the letter of the precept. So we also have to use our own wisdom to, as best we can, to recognize that we may need to really protect life, to protect someone, we may need to mislead. And then the fifth is to not take intoxicants. So with this in the context of the refuge ceremony and the way that this can be presented in the West, there are different perspectives on this vow. The strict way of holding this vow is literally, as it says, to just not take intoxicants. And an intoxicant is any substance that leads to heedlessness. So heedlessness is a loss of awareness, a loss of the ability to clearly apprehend what's happening in the world around you. And it has no medicinal purpose. So we know, of course, that painkillers and other things, it says don't operate heavy machinery, and because there's an understanding that it does lead to a lack of clarity about the outside world when we're under the influence of that medicine. But we are taking it because we are kind of below normal functioning, and we're trying to return ourselves to normal functioning. So if we're genuinely trying to do our best to return ourselves to normal functioning, and we're doing that with the least number of side effects, then it doesn't matter what the substance is. If we're genuinely trying to abide by that goal of that we are genuinely ill, and we're genuinely just trying to get back to normal functioning, and we're picking whatever it is that lets us do that with the least number of side effects and negative consequences, then that's a medicinal substance and not an intoxicant. An intoxicant is something that leads to heedlessness, and the goal is just heedlessness. The goal is just to intentionally let loose, and so on. And, it's not that the Buddha has anything against having fun, but the intent of this one really is that when we lose heedlessness, we can't maintain any of our vows or commitments because we literally don't know what's going on. We lack mindfulness. We lack the ability to respond appropriately to the outside world for that period of time. And then we're in danger of killing, stealing, lying, committing sexual misconduct, doing all kinds of things, because we simply lack the capacity to respond appropriately to the outside world. And that's the real danger of intoxicants. Now, what I said before is that particularly in the West, perhaps, many people, even when they take the refuge vows, may hold this in a slightly more relaxed way, which is to avoid becoming intoxicated. His Holiness actually, when he offers the vow, I've heard him with my own ears say, giving this vow to lay people in the West, that he's not necessarily saying, don't have a glass of wine with dinner or at a special occasion, something like that. But he is very clearly saying, do not become intoxicated. So a glass of wine, maybe if a person can stop, if a person doesn't have a problem with alcohol, for example, then maybe that's not such a big deal. I would also say, though, that if a person's taking this in a ceremony, it's quite important to try to understand how that vow is being communicated by that teacher in that ceremony. I've been in a number of, 3 or 4 refuge ceremonies with my, root guru, and it was clear to me his presentation is do not take intoxicants. And so if a person's reciting that vow and taking that vow with that teacher at that time, and that's how it's being described, then that really is how that person is taking that vow. When His Holiness is doing it, if His Holiness is saying to you, I'm not necessarily saying never, never have a glass of wine, then that is how you can understand it to being given at that moment. And I feel like that is quite important in the context of when you actually take it. If you're quote unquote taking it, just in your own mind, and this not a formal ceremony, then that's a bit different. But
Venerable, your sound is.
Sorry. Is this better? Is this okay? Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you much better.
Okay, great. Sorry. So I just think that's important, is to understand how it's actually being given when you take it. Any thoughts or questions on the 5 lay vows?
Venerable, sometimes I've heard people say, if you can't take this one, don't take it. So like you can kind of choose which vows you want to take, which is a little hard to understand, but that's what I've heard too, especially for this one.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, in the context of a formal ceremony, it's true if you don't actually engage in the recitation, after the teacher, then you haven't taken that particular vow, and so. But like I said, like His Holiness, when he does kind of try to give it in a way where people will avoid intoxication. But they may not necessarily totally avoid any and all intoxicants. So yeah, it's with all of the. I mean, it's important to understand that a person's practice is their practice. A person's Buddhist practice is kind of belongs to them, and it's their choice to kind of decide. I just think that I would say it's important to understand how it's being given. Again, going back to, if it's being given in a really strict way, and then you don't hold it in a strict way, karmically, that's, kind of a problem. But yeah, I'd say it's best, if you do have this sense that it's going to be given in a strict way, and you feel like you can't hold it in a strict way, then just take the other vows. and then maybe do your best, to at least, you know, just think about, the important thing here is to just think about, why are these vows being given? What is the point? Because again, this is the refuge ceremony is a voluntary thing. Becoming a Buddhist is a voluntary thing. So does this support my practice or not, is the question. And if it does, then like, why don't I want to support my practice? Do I kind of, is there something I need to look at? Do I need to get some support, with a certain thing? Why do I find it necessary to, when I'm dealing with stress, why am I not turning toward my practice instead of, turning toward a substance? And so again, these aren't moralistic things. These are training precepts, and we need to think about their purpose, think about why they exist, what's their meaning. Any other questions? Okay. So we covered these before. We covered these before in a general way. So here, this is just reiterating that what we talked about before about understanding the First Noble Truth, why we need to think about the First Noble Truth. Here, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying that it is not just a depressing, kind of pointless exercise. Its goal, when we understand the First Noble Truth in all of its complexity and depth, its goal is to then help us to want to overcome it. If we always just kind of have a, sorry. If we always just kind of have this idea that everything is wonderful, there's no concerns, then we will never try to overcome suffering. And that's ultimately the goal. And then he says, if we don't understand the origin, going to the second noble truth, then we won't understand the means, the antidote. So this refers to what we said before about the ordinary view. The ordinary beings also have an understanding of what they think is the origin of suffering, which is things like poverty and lack of resources. And if we think that that's true, then all we will strive for is education. And that's fine, but it doesn't actually, we're mistaken about how deep the First Noble Truth goes, and why the First Noble Truth, what the origin of the First Noble Truth really is. So if we don't understand that it's actually that active misapprehension of reality, then we won't know the actual antidote. We have to understand the actual origin to give rise to the actual antidote. And then he says, kind of harsh or visceral language, exuding total disgust, and having renunciation for that kind of existence. And he says that is the mechanism, understanding the Four Noble Truths is the mechanism that gives rise to liberation. And only by understanding them would we ever have the ability to devote ourselves to a path seeking liberation. So yeah, we already covered these. And yeah. Okay. So let me pause for questions. Let me pull up some new slides.
Can I go back to the vows on lying? If a person has a job where, like a federal agent or something, where they're working undercover and they're constantly having to deceive people to get information, how does that fit into that vow?
I think it's hard to say, because again, all of these are karmic actions that we can't really judge from the outside. All of these pieces of information are meant for oneself, in terms of judging what is my motivation, what is my, so, in that sense, that person probably is thinking of themselves as trying to right a wrong in society. They're seeing that, this drug cartel or are destroying lives, and they're trying to benefit others by. But then, of course, we can't just say that the ends completely justify the means, and that, you know so it's quite, and that's what makes karma so much more difficult than anything else, is because there aren't clear, easy rules for saying, this is a positive karmic action, this is negative karmic action. It really comes down to what's actually happening in the mind of that person as this action is being engaged in, and to what extent is that person clearly seeing the circumstance, to what extent is their mind under the influence of negative action, of afflictions and delusions, how obscured, how clear is their perception. It's so complicated. And so that's really, we kind of just have to focus on applying the teachings to ourselves, and kind of not worrying, because it just gets impossible to be like ascribing things and motivations to, because we barely understand our own motivations. We're barely capable of having a real clear understanding of why we engage in actions. What are we really trying to benefit this person, or is our motivation self-serving? Are we trying to be seen favorably by that person? Are we trying to be seen, the 8 worldly concerns? Are we trying to get a better reputation? Are we trying to get more wealth, more status, more comfort? Or are we really just genuinely trying to be of benefit to others? And just parsing that out is our life's work, really. And it's incredibly difficult. And we kind of just have to only try to do that, because it's so difficult. But yeah, I mean, all of the crimes and things that people, the undercover officers may or may not commit in the service of, and I think it can cause all kind, it can cause PTSD and all kinds of problems that people go through, and it's really, it can be really damaging, because they have this idea of trying to create some kind of change. But we have to also understand, that the world is the way that it is because of the arising of karma, and that trying to make it be different through external actions is much less effective than trying to actually change the karma that gave rise to it. So just putting people in jail, that doesn't, the wheel of all of that negativity that underlies why there is a drug trade, why there are gangs, why, it doesn't do anything to deal. It's just kind of whack-a-mole on the surface, and it's kind of pointless. I mean, there's not entirely pointless, because you might be prolonging some specific lives, you might be saying, and there's benefit to that. But we also have to understand that there's a deeper karmic process at work, and that deeper karmic process is unaffected by that kind of very, very surface level operation. So it's quite difficult. Anything else?
One of the issues that I have is that there's so much in the Buddhist literature where it feels like a heavy emphasis on prescriptive behavior, and that it really gets heavily weighted in that direction. And I find that difficult because probably most of us who come to Buddhism have lived for a while and have examined our ethics pretty carefully. And then to just feel like this is getting, the drum is being beaten very, very consistently. I kind of understand it, but I have some resistance. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, again, I think that resistance, I mean, in my mind, my resistance comes from thinking of looking at the teachings that the Buddha gave in the same way that I look at the teachings of Christianity and other things, where it seems to me that the goal is to get people to get along. The goal could even be, in a more cynical way, you could think of the goal as like pacifying the masses and that sort of thing. If we think that that is the goal of why the teachings exist, then there is going to be that resistance. And that's where when I have resistance is because it can be hard to distinguish. But like I said, that's why we have to recognize that the Buddha is just giving us a warning based on his own direct experience. And he's saying, if you don't want to suffer, here's how to do that. If you do want to suffer, here is how you're creating your suffering. And he's not interested I mean, to some degree, he has some interest in that wider social issues, of course, but he's primarily interested in giving people the tools to really put an end to their suffering. And if that's why the teachings exist, then that's really quite different than, the opiate for the masses of religion, that kind of view. So, and this is just something that we have to wrestle with and think about. There isn't a right or wrong way of thinking about it, but if we can get to that view, then we'll see that this is just that the Buddha is saying, this is what is most helpful for you to adopt. This is what is most helpful for you to reject and to put down, to set aside, if you want to really be free of suffering. And that just is something that we have to genuinely get to a place where we believe that that's true, or where we have confidence that that is true, which is very difficult. Any other? Okay. So what we're going to start going into now is kind of a presentation of the lamrim, or the stages of the path. And so let me. Okay. So the lamrim is a commentarial effort to organize the teachings of the historical Buddha. So it's a later commentarial effort, a textual commentarial effort to organize the teachings of the Buddha in a way that is cogent and easy for practitioners to understand what the Buddha's intent was, and how to progressively train in what the Buddha taught. So it organizes and systematizes the original teachings of the Buddha, the sutra material of the Buddha, in what's called the lamrim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment. And it really began with Lama Atisha. His lamp for the path to enlightenment was really the first effort to try to organize the teachings in this way. And you can see here that this is a much later effort after the the passing of the Buddha, that it happened really for the first time, about 1,500 years later. So much later than the actual sutra material. And then even later than that, almost recent history, Lama Tsongkhapa came along, and he's the founder of the Gelug tradition, which is, as I mentioned in the first class, the school of Tibetan Buddhism that our center is steeped in. And he also wrote lamrim texts. Many lamas wrote lamrim texts, but in the Gelug tradition, the lamrim texts written by Lama Tsongkhapa are the most definitive from that perspective. And that's what we will be using. We'll be using what's called the Foundation of All Good Qualities by Lama Tsongkhapa. Okay, so one way of thinking about lamrim is that it's organized into three scopes: the small scope, the middling scope, and the great scope. The small scope, so the small scope, I advanced a little bit too quickly. The small scope, these three are distinguished in the motivation of the practitioner. A practitioner of the small scope is a practitioner who cares more about their future lives than they do about their present life. They care more about their overall spiritual trajectory than they do about the content of this specific individual lifetime. So that's an extraordinary transformation of what a person cares about. For ordinary beings, what they care about is like what's happening tomorrow, what kind of comfort, what kind of wealth, what kind of status, what kind of reputation, what kind of pleasant, conducive circumstances can I secure for myself tomorrow, next week, next year, not what's going to happen when I die, what's my overall spiritual trajectory. So becoming a genuine small scope practitioner is difficult, and not something that just happens when we become a good person, or we try to be a good person. It actually is caring more about our overall spiritual trajectory than it is about amassing comfort in this life. A middle scope practitioner is a person who matures in their motivation, and they recognize that even good future rebirths, even having a good trajectory, is not sufficient. That because for example, our lives are considered a good rebirth, and yet there's still quite a lot of suffering, still quite a lot of unsatisfactory conditions, even though we have really the best possible kind of ordinary rebirth. And so a middle scope practitioner wants to put an end to cyclic existence as a whole. They want to stop participating in cyclic existence as a whole. And so that is the mind of what's called renunciation, which came up a little bit earlier, where we recognize that there is nowhere in ordinary cyclic existence that we can be born where we're free from suffering. We can be relatively more or less, suffering, but we're never fully free from it as long as we're within ordinary cyclic existence. So a middling scope practitioner wants to put an end to cyclic existence for themselves. And this is the motivation of a practitioner who's practicing Theravada. This is where the lamrim kind of, the low scope or the small scope and the middle scope from the Mahayana perspective are practices that are held in common. What they would say is that this is a training or a practice held in common with a practitioner of the low scope or with a practitioner of the middle scope, because the great scope is unique to the Mahayana tradition. We have to progress through the small scope and the middle scope, but small scope is also sometimes called low scope, but I think small scope is better from an English perspective. I like it more. But from a Mahayana perspective, we're meant to aspire to the great scope. And so as we're progressing, we relate to that as the practices that are held in common with practitioners of the small scope and the middle scope, because the great scope reflects an additional maturation of motivation. This practitioner isn't trying to put an end to cyclic existence for themselves alone, like a middling scope practitioner. They are trying to put an end to cyclic existence for each and every sentient being. So this is the bodhicitta motivation, the highest motivation that a practitioner can have, is the wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, which means wanting to bring all other sentient beings also into the state of full enlightenment. That's unique to the great scope. You don't find the great scope in the Theravada tradition, the Southeast Asian tradition, the individual vehicle. But still, a great scope practitioner must train in the scopes in common with low scope practitioners and middling practitioners. It's just that they should hold in their mind the aspiration to practice the great scope, to create the causes and the conditions to become a great scope practitioner. Any questions about that? Okay. So another way of talking about the lamrim is to say that it has 4 features. And lamrim, I think I defined it, in English literally means stages of the path to enlightenment. So the 4 features, the first of the 4 features is that none of the teachings are contradictory. So here we understand, when we look at the lamrim as a whole, we look at the low scope, middle scope, and great scope, we can see that the Buddha's teachings were given to disciples of varying dispositions. And so for that particular disciple, for that particular small scope disciple or middling scope disciple or great scope disciple, then even though the Buddha might describe the same concept in ways that could seem contradictory, we can see that the purpose was to benefit beings who themselves were in different places with their practice. And so the Buddha's teachings were given to benefit sentient beings. And even though they may look contradictory, we can see that they play an important role in benefiting sentient beings who are in different places. In the same way that if you're Neil deGrasse Tyson and you're traveling the world explaining astrophysics to people, you're going to say things to a preschool student that contradict the things that you're going to say to a PhD student or a colleague. Not because you're, lying or saying, but because you're presenting the material at the right level of depth and complexity for the person that you're speaking to, and your goal is to help them, progress in their process of understanding the teachings here, in whether it's astrophysics or whether it's Buddhism. It doesn't matter. You have to tailor what you're saying appropriately, and that's what the Buddha did. And another feature is that we're meant to understand that nothing that the Buddha says is just kind of interesting. None of it is just like a factoid that he's giving. The lamrim, when we study the lamrim and we understand that all of it is leading us to enlightenment, then we see everything that the Buddha taught through the lens of, how do I take this as personal advice? What can I actually, that if we don't understand how to do that, then we just haven't thought about that particular teaching in that way. We need to try to figure out, okay, given that everything that the Buddha taught can fit into this paradigm of leading sentient beings to enlightenment, how do I understand this specific teaching for my own personal practice? How does it lead me to enlightenment? Okay. The threefold path. Yeah. So then the threefold path is and just another division of understanding the material from the perspective of the scopes, those divisions of for whom are they given? Are they given to this kind of practitioner, that kind of practitioner? And then this is the teachings are protected from the fault of abandoning the Dharma. Means, again, that we shouldn't denigrate the small scope or the middle scope. We have to practice it ourselves. We have to actually become a small scope practitioner. We have to actually become a middle scope practitioner before we can become a great scope practitioner. We have to understand that it's a step-by-step process that we have to go through, and that if we skip a step, we won't get that result. If we ignore the low scope, if we ignore the middle scope, and we just say, oh, how wonderful it would be if I was a great scope practitioner, we won't actually do it. So we recognize that none of these teachings are below us. None of these teachings are meant for, if we aspire to the great scope, then we see that we have to move through the small scope and the middle scope. And so we can't abandon any of it. We can't set aside anything that the Buddha taught, because it's all part of the process of getting to the great scope, of actually culminating in enlightenment. But if we denigrate it, or if we say, oh, that's only for Theravada practitioners, or that's only, then we make the mistake of abandoning the Dharma. And this, presenting it in this way, is seeing it as the stages of the path, will protect our mind from doing that, will protect us from denigrating some of the teachings. Any thoughts about the four features of the lamrim? So here, of course, again, lamrim doesn't mean the things that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote. It means all of the efforts, it's just that among all of those efforts in the Gelug tradition, the texts that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote are the most definitive, are presented as the most definitive. No. Okay, so now we're going to look in more detail on each of these scopes. So we're going to go back to the small scope and progress through. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be using the foundation of all good qualities to do that. And the first verse is, we have 9 minutes. The foundation of all good qualities is the kind and venerable guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. So here, this is the first verse of the lamrim, and here we're really kind of setting the stage where, in a way, sometimes in lamrim text, this is sort of presented as prior to the small scope, prior to the motivation of developing the aspiration to think more about future lives than this life, because here it literally says the foundation of all good qualities, which is the title of the text, but it's also the first line, is the kind and venerable guru. So that means our own good qualities come from the guru, come from the teachings that the guru gives. Our ability to our own ability to generate good qualities is the result of our understanding of what to practice, what to abandon, and that comes from the teacher, from the guru. And so here it says, correct devotion to him is the root of the path. Of course, this is an ancient text in the 1300s, 1400s. And of course, at that time, basically it was a very patriarchal society, still is a very patriarchal society. And so all of the teachers were male. But of course, now that's not true anymore. There are many very highly qualified, fully realized female teachers. So it isn't accurate to say that the guru is a him. That's just the way that this text is written, because it was true at the time. But what it does mean is that properly relating to one spiritual guide, because one spiritual guide is the person that reveals the teachings in this life and in previous lives, relating properly to that person, it has an incredibly important role in everything that will come after, in all of the, in the way that we progress through all of the stages of the path. So it's not directly a teaching, the practice of what's called guru devotion or correct, proper reliance. A lot of Westerners prefer the phrase proper reliance, how to properly rely, because guru devotion in our society, in our culture, in our way of thinking isn't, is kind of a more fraught idea. But how to understand how to properly rely on the spiritual guide is critically important to progressing through the stages of the path, all of the stages of the path, which is why it is here the root of the path, correctly, proper reliance. So this is a huge topic, how to, whether we have a teacher yet or we don't have a teacher yet, understanding the qualities of a teacher. It's a huge topic, and next week we'll go into it a bit more in terms of all of that, because we just really don't have time. But Yeah. So the idea here is that for us, even Geshe Zopa, reiterated in his Friday night teaching a couple of weeks ago, reiterated the idea that for us, the people who are alive now and can explain things now and who can guide us now, people like Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Geshe Sherab and all of these great teachers, these people who can show us, and that we can ask questions of and get feedback from and guidance from, they're kinder to us than the historical Buddha was, because it's this lifetime that we can achieve enlightenment. It's this lifetime where we can create the causes. If we don't achieve enlightenment in this very lifetime, it's at least this very lifetime where we can create all of the causes and the conditions to quickly achieve enlightenment. And the people who are present in our world, who actually are doing that active guidance, are most directly responsible for whether or not that will happen. So when we take a teacher, when we relate to someone as our guide, as our guru, as our teacher, then that comes with, the responsibility of properly relying on that spiritual guide. And then there's a whole, in any lamrim text, you find a whole chapter on kind of what that means. And of course, this is a very fraught topic too, because it also, if a person doesn't, and even when a person does really check and does everything kind of to the best of their ability, not all people who are, presented as teachers, not all of them really have good qualities. Not all of them really are proper gurus. And we can go down, I think Venerable Urbina says, go down garden paths by following the wrong kind of teacher. And we can be taken advantage of, and we can be, and even when we try really hard to do that correctly, and still people have negative experiences with that. So it's quite difficult. So it's a very fraught topic, particularly for the West. And yet, it's important to do that checking, to do that clear recognition and understanding. And then when we do feel like we have the right teacher, to then have that proper attitude, which doesn't mean allowing them, doesn't mean if they demonstrate things that we find that our mind isn't, capable of handling, or that we think are really harmful, doesn't mean allowing that to continue. We may separate from that circumstance, but we try to maintain sort of a more equanimous mind as we do that. And we do our very best to head that off by doing as much checking, as much research, as much investigation as we possibly can. But still, it's difficult, and yeah, many people did that, and still there were problems. Any thoughts or questions? I know.
Save mine until
Well,
next time,
yeah,
for sure, because I have
well,
quite a lot to say on this.
yeah, it's a huge topic. Should we just leave it there then? All right. So, so we'll dedicate then. So recollect our motivation that we established, our positive altruistic motivation, and think that we wanted to find tools and techniques and ideas to put into practice. And so we've listened with that motivation, that broad altruistic motivation, and wanting to fulfill that motivation has created positive energy in the mind, and we offer that positive energy for the benefit of sentient beings. Thinking, may that positive energy ripen in whatever way is beneficial for sentient beings. May it create the causes and the conditions for sentient beings to quickly ripen their minds, achieve the state of enlightenment. May it serve as a cause and condition for that to happen in one's own mind as well, so that oneself can have the ability to benefit sentient beings without mistake. And may that positive energy pacify any hindrances to the Guru's long life. So just think along those lines, and in whatever way you want, offer that positive energy. Not holding on to it, just letting it go completely. All right. Well, thanks for coming. We'll see everybody again next week.